Hey folks, it's 6:30 and we should be there. We are. We're live. Woohoo! So we have a couple of people here, and other people will trickle in or not as they prefer. And but we're going to get going as any of excuse me. So a couple of housekeeping items just to get started. One is Tim Campbell is here, and hey, Tim! Tim is the grand poobah for this group, and this group basically wouldn't exist without him. So thank you to Tim. He's the one who pays our dues. We do have to pay to be a member of Meetup.com, and Tim pays it out of his own pocket, but I'm sure if anybody wanted to contribute, you could message him through Meetup and he can let you know how to do that, whether you buy him a coffee or a new car or somewhere in between. Um, and The other thing is that this group exists basically um, because of its members, and there are more than 2,400 quote unquote official members in this group, and but there aren't very many voices. So this group lives or dies based on you. And so, hey Tim, the other Tim, Tim Agason, is here joining us as well. So yeah, this group lives or dies based on you. And so if you have any suggestions or ideas on things we can cover or anything you want to take care of or join in, that's much appreciated. Um, and as I mentioned the last time, normally I tell people where the washrooms are, but if you don't know, well, there's not much I can do to help you. This is the third one of these I think that I've done, and so far nobody's thrown rotten fruit at me, at least not that I can tell. I have no idea what your screens look like, but um, anyway, so we will move on. Yes, this is being recorded, and if you have any questions, you can type them in. I'm not sure what the criteria are for that. I know you have to be signed into Google, but you can also type a question in the comments on the Meetup page for this group, or you can send me a message through Meetup, or you can go to our website, Marcia and my website, which is www.wolfandl.com. Actually, give me a second and I'll pull that up here. Notepad. So drag that over here. There we go. So if you want to find me, you go to this address. And among other things, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 80 tutorials on photography. A lot of them have to do with Lightroom, but there's some other stuff in there as well. And you can also fill in a comment on and send me an email and I'll get back to you. So that still pretty much covers the ways you can get in touch with me. So I'll get rid of that. We don't need it anymore. Okay, so as I mentioned in the description, tonight we're going to be talking about merging images 4 different ways. Most people, as I said in the description, most people go out, they make an image, they come back, they process it or not. They may share it on social media, they may print it, but you know that one image is it. And then there are the weird, the few like me who take great delight in making multiple images into one final composite. So the last talk I did was on Snapseed, which is a fairly simple Cynthia asked for my URL. Hang on. https://www.wolfandl.com. There you go. Okay, so the last talk I did on Snapseed, which is a fairly simple smartphone app, and it took me 2 hours to do that. In about 2 hours, Marcia's going to come and bang down the door. So we're in the immortal words of Willy Wonka, we have so much time and so little to do. Strike that, reverse it. So we're not doing a deep dive. We're just going to barely get a toe in, but we'll see how far we can go. So there are at least 6 or 7 reasons that I can think of that you'd want to combine multiple images together. Um, and we're going to be covering 4, well, sort of 5 of them. Composites or another one, star trails or another one, and pixel shifting or another one. Each one of these techniques has 2 parts. There's the camera work and the software work. And we're not going to be talking too much about the camera work, but we'll mention a little bit here and there. And we're going to focus a little bit more on the software. Pretty much all of these techniques, movement is the enemy. So for almost all of this work, you need a sturdy tripod. There are some exceptions to that, and we'll get to those as we go along. So the first one we're going to talk about is HDR, and it stands for high dynamic range. And if you ask most people, they have actually no idea what HDR really means. You hear about an HDR look, you hear about making an HDR image, an HDR from one image. That's not HDR. Sorry to tell you, but that's just the way it is. That's tone mapping. So we're going to go back to the Bible, the book of Genesis, part 1. And in the beginning, the Lord said, let there be photons. And there were photons, and it was good. We call it light, but photons sounds more impressive, so we'll use photons. Light is basically multi-directional. It bounces off in every direction. And what is a photon? Well, if you want to get technical, a photon is a quantum of electromagnetic radiation. It's a massless particle, but we're not going to, this isn't a physics course, so we'll leave it at that. You know about light, and everything we see is light bouncing off something and then reflecting into our eye. And the energy in the photon is what stimulates the eye to send a signal to our brain that says, oh, look at that. It's a coffee cup or a tree or a mug or something. If you've been around photography a little bit or a lot, you've heard about the trifecta of exposure, which consists of the aperture or f-stop, that's the size of the lens opening, and shutter speed, which is what opens the camera to allow light to access the sensor and then closes again, and then ISO, which ISO is actually a generic term. It just means International Standards Organization. But for our purposes, it refers to the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Now, in any scene, at any time, we have a given amount of light, and we can't change that. I mean, obviously if you have studio lights or flashlights, you can augment it, but in any scene, you have a given amount of light. The aperture and the shutter speed control how much of that light reaches your sensor. Okay, now your camera sensor very, very quickly is made up of a bunch of really tiny solar panels. Each one is in the neighborhood of several microns, and a micron is thousandth of a millimeter, so they're pretty tiny. And then there's a color filter system that fits over top of that. We're not going to get into that because we don't have time. But so the shutter speed and the aperture control the amount of light reaching the sensor. Each sensor receives that light, and again, the energy in the photons activate them. That gets converted into an electrical signal, and then that electrical signal gets run through an analog to digital controller, and it ends up as a number. Okay. Now the ISO value is an amplifier. That's all it is. It's amplifying that signal by a little bit or a lot. You go way back in the film days, and we had something called Tri-X 400, which was an ISO 400, and everybody was like, wow. And if you were really fancy, some days you could take it and push it to maybe 800. My Sony A7R III goes up to ISO 104,200 with digital gain and other things like that. So, we're also going to talk just for a moment about 8-bit, 16-bit, and 32-bit images, because that comes into play when we talk about HDR. If you shoot JPEG, you've got an 8-bit image. Now, what does that mean? Well, everything in computers, including digital cameras, and digital cameras are just a computer with a lens stuck on the front of it. Everything in computers is binary, ones and zeros. So an 8-bit means 2, so a 1 or a 0, to the 8th power. So 2 to the 8th is 256. So an 8-bit image has 256 possible levels of information for each of the 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. 16-bit is 2 to the 16th power, and that means you've got 16 million possible levels for each of the 3 colors. And if you shoot RAW, you're shooting in 16-bit. Now, there are no sensors that actually make 16-bit images. They're usually 12 to 14 bits, and then they get mapped out into a 16-bit space. But again, we don't have time to talk about all this crap. If you make HDR images, generally you're working with 16-bit files, and they get mapped out into 32-bit images. And 32-bit images have more than 2.3 billion levels of information for each of the 3 color channels. Okay, so if you talk about an HDR image or making, an HDR look, or if you talk about making an HDR from one image, then you're not adding any extra information. You're just dealing with one. However, when you mention HDR, this is what most people think about. This is not HDR, this is tone mapping. Okay. Tone mapping is a way of taking all of that extra information that you've got and stretching it and twisting it and pulling it apart. And you can make it look like this, and some people really like it, and some people think it's ugly, and life goes on. You get to choose. But that's not where HDR starts. So to begin to talk about HDR, we're going to back up here a little bit, and we're going to start with this image. So 3 images. One of these is an HDR image. Which one? I won't be able to hear your answers, so we won't count down, and I'll just tell you. If you pick door number 1, you are correct. This is an HDR image. This was made with my phone, and it's from 3 separate exposures. Both of these are single image, tone mapped images. Okay, so this is not an HDR image. This is not an HDR image. This is an HDR image. It doesn't look much like this one or this one. It could. I've got extra information I can play with, and I can stretch it around, but that's not the essential point of HDR. Okay, so we'll start here. Let's assume we have a broad range of tones in our scene. Now, not every image that we're looking at, not every scene, oops, sorry, back up, try this one. Not every scene, don't mess with me. I've had a long day already. There we go. Not every scene has a wide dynamic range. If you look at this image, we've got some dark shadows, we've got some middle gray tones, but if we go over here and look at the histogram, you're going to see that there's nothing on the right here. So there's no real bright pixels in this image at all. And so this is not an image for which you need to shoot HDR. But in our hypothetical image, this one, okay, we've got a broad range of tones. Now, dynamic range is not the range of tones. The dynamic range is the ability to separate the tones. Okay, so this is a dynamic range of about 16-bit, and there are no cameras today that have 16 bits of dynamic range. Phase 1 IQ4 just came out with, they have a software upgrade that shoots 2 images, sort of a pseudo HDR, and then gives you 15 bits of dynamic range. But we're going to start with this scene, and we're going to assume that we have a camera that has a smaller amount of dynamic range. So it's still capturing everything from white to black as best as can, but the tones are coarser. They're not as well refined. Okay, so if we match this sensor up against this image, we can either underexpose the image, overexpose the image, and if we do that, we're going to capture the darker tones in the scene, but everything brighter than that is going to get washed out to pure white. Okay, We could go for the middle values, in which case the gray tones in the middle of our scene, the middle levels, will get captured by our sensor. But anything darker than that and anything lighter than that, again, are going to be washed out. Anything here in this range is going to be pure black, and anything in this range is going to be pure white. Or we could overexpose our image, correction, underexpose our image, in which case we're going to capture our lighter tones, but by underexposing, all of this is going to end up being black. Okay, so those are our three baseline images. In this image, we've got the lighter tones. In this image, we've got the middle tones. And in this image, we've got the darker tones. The HDR process takes all of this information from these three images and combines them into one final image. Now, there are choices when you're doing your HDR exposures. Do you shoot one f-stop apart, two stops apart? Do you make 3 images? Do you make 5 images? The correct answer to that question is it depends. It depends a lot on your camera, and it depends a lot on the scene. You have to look at the scene and decide where you're going to need recovery. Does this image have a lot of bright tones? Does it have a lot of dark tones? But we'll back out of that for a second, and we're going to go over to back here, and I'm going to take this image is one single image made with my Sony A7R III camera, and you can see it. My camera, actually, before we get to that, there's one thing I forgot to mention. So let's just go back over here for a second. Your camera will have a specific dynamic range, and the manufacturers will tell you you've got 5 stops, 7 stops, 10 stops, 14 stops of dynamic range. What they don't tell you is that dynamic range changes based on ISO. So if we look at this image, for example, this is my Sony A7R III, and if you look up here, it's got, at ISO 100, it's got about 13 stops of dynamic range. If we get down here to ISO 4000, now we're down to 9 stops of dynamic range. Okay, they don't put that in the brochure. So it's probably not in the user manual either, but it's something you should be aware of. So the higher you raise your ISO value, the less dynamic range you have to work with. Okay, now we're going to go back over here. So this is our single image made with my Sony A7R III. And you can see it's done a pretty good job of capturing the scene. There's still a little bit of detail in the logs. The clouds aren't washed out too much. If we get out of that and go to my cell phone, here you can see in this log here it's starting to get washed out, and there's some really deep black shadows in there. Okay, so this, my cell phone camera, this is a Samsung Galaxy S6, does not have anywhere near the dynamic range of my Sony A7R III. Okay. So if we were to take my Sony A7R III and make 5 images, this is my 0 exposure image. This is 2 stops underexposed, 4 stops underexposed, 2 stops overexposed, and 4 stops overexposed. Now, in this image, I've captured all of the shadow detail, same in here. And in this image, I've captured, these 2 images, I've captured all of the highlight detail. And this captures all of my midtones. So if I take these and kind of mash them into one image, we end up with our final HDR file. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to Affinity Photo. Now, there are a lot of different software programs you can use to make HDR images. If you use Lightroom, then Lightroom has its own way of doing HDRs. Photoshop has its own way of doing HDRs. If you don't have Lightroom or Photoshop, this is Affinity Photo. You can use Affinity Photo to make HDRs. If you don't have Affinity Photo or Photoshop, you can use GIMP, which is another pixel editor but it's free. It's GIMP. You just type GIMP online. You can get a plugin for GIMP that will allow you to merge HDR images. Um, there's a program called Photomatics that does HDRs. There's DxO makes a product called HDR FX Pro. So but the idea behind all of them the same. So I'm not going to take all these 5 images. I'm just going to take 3 of them. This one and these 2. We'll leave the darkest one and the lightest one because we don't really need them. And sorry, just trying to open these. That's not what I wanted it to do. So we're going to let it think for a minute. Excuse me. Okay. So these are 3. The darkest one, the lightest one, and the mid-tone one. We're going to cancel that because we don't need to develop them. We'll come back to the raw development part in a minute. But I just wanted you to see. So let's cancel that. Okay. So to make an HDR image, cancel that. Cool. All right. You go to File, HDR Merge. It's a little bit different in Photoshop or Lightroom, but the idea is the same. Actually, in Lightroom, you would select your images and go Control H or Command H if you're on a Mac. So we're going to add these 3 images to our HDR merge stack instead. That one to that one. Okay, now automatically align images. You can make HDRs handheld if you hold your camera steady and try not to wiggle around too much. Okay, but even so, it's best to automatically align. Automatically remove ghosts. What's a ghost? Well, a ghost is something that's in one image that moved in the other 2 images. Okay, so I don't think there's any ghosts in here, but it wouldn't hurt. Noise reduction, again, it depends on your camera. That's why I leave it set for mine. And the bottom one is tone map HDR image. We're going to turn that off because we don't want the software to tone map it for us. Okay, we click OK, and this is going to take a minute. But what it's doing is starting to aligning the images. I did have this prepared in advance, but there's one feature I need to show you, and in order to show you it, it has to do it live. So we're just going to let it run. So now what it's doing is this HDR merge. So it's going through each of the 3 images, pixel by pixel, and looking at and comparing them and thinking, okay, I'm going to take this pixel from this image, and I'll go to the next pixel and take this pixel from this image and go to the next pixel and take this pixel from this image, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's going to combine all 3 of those into our final HDR merge. Again, this is going to take a little while. I got like 17 different programs running right now between the live stream software and YouTube and the photo programs that I'm working with. So trying really hard not to give my computer a heart attack. But I will beg your patience. For the rest of these, I'm not going to let it run. I actually have merged files that we'll work with. But as I mentioned, there's one feature of Affinity Photo I wanted to show you. This Tim asked me what the program is. This is called Affinity Photo. It's from a company in England. It's affinity.serif.com. They make Affinity Photo, which is very similar to Photoshop. They make Affinity Designer, which is very similar to Adobe Illustrator, and they make Affinity Publisher, which is very similar to. Okay, it did that so well it crashed. Oh no, there we are. We're back. Okay, so right now it's just running the denoise program. They make Affinity Publisher, which is very similar to InDesign. Now, if you, as you probably know, Adobe doesn't sell software anymore. They only rent it. You can get Lightroom and Photoshop for their special deal of $10 US a month or something like that. And but if you wanted to add in Illustrator and InDesign, it would cost you $50 a month. So that would be $600 a year, and you can get Affinity Photo, Affinity Designer, and Affinity Publisher, all three for a one-time low price. And yes, you can actually buy it. I don't remember the current price, but I believe you get all three for under $200. Um, it does some things differently than Photoshop. There are probably things Photoshop does better, but Photoshop's been around for 30 years. And anyway, okay, so this is our final HDR merge. And the reason I ran through that is I wanted to point out the sources panel. And there are our HDR image, a deghosted HDR image, and then our three basic images in this panel. And what you can do with this panel is if there's anything that you need to remove using the healing brush or the clone brush, for example, you can actually pick on one of these and make changes to that, and then it'll get mapped out to the whole HDR image. We're not going to deal with that because we don't have time, but that's sources panel is why I wanted to let it run. Okay, so we're just going to come back here, close that, and we'll go to our layers, and we're just gonna, it's a bit dark, so we're just gonna do a quick levels adjustment here. Um, take this down to somewhere about there. Okay, now we can see it. I thought I got rid of you. Okay, um, so you'll notice two things about this image. One is that the horizon is curved, and the reason is that this image was made with a 24 millimeter wide angle lens, and because of that, it has distortion. Now, if I go back over to here and look at this image, oops, come on now, take this image. Okay, the horizon is flat. So why is it curved in the HDR image but flat here? And the reason is something called lens correction. When this is Capture One, and I don't use Lightroom anymore. I use Capture One, but it doesn't matter if you import an image into Lightroom or into Capture One or even into Affinity Photo. That's where the raw develop stage of our import in Affinity Photo was. There's something called lens corrections. It will look at the lens from the metadata of the camera, and it will modify it to take out the distortion. To make this HDR merge, we just took the three raw files. So you have two choices. You can either take your raw files from Lightroom or from Capture One or whatever and export them as TIFF files with the lens correction built in, or alternately open, if Affinity Photo is the program you're working with, you can open the raw file in Affinity Photo, do the lens correction, save it out as a TIFF, and then create your HDR merge with those three TIFF files. But the other thing you can do is we're going to cheat a little bit. So we're going to add another pixel layer, and we're going to go here to our brush tool, and we have a brush size of 6 pixels, and we're just going to make it red. And then we're going to click over here on the left-hand side, hold down the shift key, and click over there. Okay, so now that shows us how much our horizon line is bowed. We'll go back to our main image layer, and we're going to go to filters, distort, perspective, and then just pull this up here so it makes it more obvious. It says single plane, and we're going to change that to dual plane, and we don't need to show the grid. I'm just going to move that out of the way. So now I'm going to take this dot here in the middle, and I'm just going to pull it down until our horizon looks, I'm not going to waste a lot of time on it, but you get the idea. So we click apply, and then we can take this pixel layer with the red line in it and just delete it. And now we have a more or less flat horizon. It's much better to do it, in advance and use the lens correction tools. That's what they're for. Now the other thing is, you'll notice up here in the corners we have some vignetting. Again, being a wide-angle lens, um, it's darkened in the corners. It's not as obvious in the lower two corners, but that's easy enough to fix. Before we get to that, though, we're going to do a couple of things. One is we're going to take our crop tool and we're just going to pull it down here and get rid of that space at the top. That looks better. Now in Affinity Photo, there are a number of tabs up here at the top, and we're in the photo persona. They call them personas. They're basically sub-functions of the software, and this is very similar across Photo Designer and Publisher. Next one is the Liquify persona. The next one is the Develop persona. The Develop persona is very much like Adobe Camera Raw or the Develop module in Lightroom. Next to that, we have the tone mapping persona. Okay, now I mentioned earlier that we had converted our 16-bit RAW files into a 32-bit HDR file. So it's just going to take a second to run. But this is where, because we have all of this extra information, that we can, as soon as this is done what it's doing here, we can start to push it around. Yeah, it's not going to respond until it's ready. The the images from my Sony A7R III are about 82 megabytes each, so this final composite image is probably in the neighborhood of 200 to 250 megabytes. So it's it can take a little bit of chewing. I should have done this with the cell phone images because they're only like 5 megabytes each. It would have been a lot faster. But if you will indulge me with your patience, then I would appreciate it. Okay. Whoa, that's ugly. Um, Turn our tone compression back down to 0. There we go. Okay, so over here on the right is where we have our tone map options, and this is where, if you don't like tone mapping, you can call it make my image look ugly. We can increase local contrast, we can vary the exposure, and you can see there's too much. Drag that down a little bit. Yeah, maybe 0. Um, we can get into as much, if we get into detail refinement, for example, we can bring out more detail. Um, we can make it look really, well, like the first image you saw. We're not going to deal with that right now, but this is the tone mapping persona. Now, I don't use Affinity Photo much for making, I forgot about these guys up here in the corner. Just apply that. If you work in Photoshop, Photoshop has something called content-aware fill. If you work in Affinity Photo, it's called inpainting, and it's basically the same idea. So if we go to zoom into 100% and go up here to the top left corner, click our inpainting brush. If you're used to working in Lightroom, for example, you have the clones tool or the healing tool, but the healing tool just grabs a section of the image and tries to blend it into the area being healed. Inpainting or content-aware fill in Photoshop uh, basically goes beyond that. So when I let go of my mouse, the inpainting brush is now going to look at the surrounding pixels to that spot, and it's going to match them up as best it can. All right. Oh, no, you can do better than that. Hmm. I think it's just giving me a hard time because I have so many programs running. But normally it would just clean that up like nothing. You'll just have to take my word for it. Inpainting is also handy for dust spots, and this is where you can see how dirty my sensor is. There's one there. There's one there. But basically, that's how you would go through and clean up vignetting in the corners. Again, if you did the lens correction part first, it would take care of most of that and you wouldn't have to deal with this, but that's what inpainting is all about. Okay, so we're going to close that, and no, we don't need to say that. As I mentioned a minute ago, I don't actually do most of my uh, HDR merges in Affinity Photo. This is a program, not that one, this one. This is a program called SNS HDR. I believe it's also from a company out of England, but I could be wrong. And it's the same process. You select your images, um, and it combines them into an HDR. I've already done that in this particular case. Um, and so this is my HDR image. And what I like about SNS HDR is that it has a number of built-in defaults in terms of how you want to tone map your image. This is natural. This is neutral, which means everything has been zeroed. Natural is the most natural looking of the, um, this is night. And you can also create your own presets. And so if I click up here on the plus sign, after having manipulated these guys over here, um, then I can create my own presets. Now, the other thing I like about SNS HDR is that I can globally increase the brightness or decrease the brightness or change the contrast. But you see this line here that goes through the color channel. I could, if I wanted to, just increase the contrast in the greens. So it's not affecting the rest of the image, it's only affecting the greens. Okay. I can change my white point. I can do all of the same sort of tone mapping stuff that you can do in HDR. If I go down to advanced though, come on now, there we go. I have more of these bars. So if I want to emphasize the light in just the blues, I can do that without affecting any other colors, you see. If I want to increase the details in just the greens, I can do that without affecting the sky. And I can do more than one in each, like, and for example, if I wanted to darken the sky and at the same time lighten the flowers in front, I can do that. Okay, I could add more clarity to just the plants and blur the blue out a bit. Okay, I can also adjust color temperature and stuff like that. But this is the program I use most of the time. There are 3 different versions. There's a free version. In my opinion, it's not worth the price. And then there's the standard version, which is this one, and which is about $50 US, I believe. And then for another $30 US, there's the Pro version. And the only difference that I can tell between the Pro version and the standard version is that the Pro version allows you to do batches of images. So if you have more than one group of HDR shots, you can combine them all into a one batch, and it'll process them all simultaneously. And then, but I like it because it allows me to make my own presets, and we'll come back to that. Why that would be important to me later. Okay, so no, we're not going to say that. And that's pretty much all we're going to have time for in terms of HDR for today, because it's already more than half an hour gone. So, yeah, we did that one. So the next thing we're going to talk about is focus stacking. And focus stacking, in order to understand focus stacking, we need to understand depth of field. And in the past, when I've tried to describe depth of field, I've used computer graphics and hand signals and things, and people always end up looking at me funny, because in order to understand depth of field, you need to understand circles of confusion. Yeah, that's the confusing part. So this time I went old school, and I'm going to hold this up and hopefully the camera will focus on it. So this bamboo skewer represents the line from my camera, which is where my fingers are, to my subject, which is this little blue piece of paper here. Okay. So I guess if you were looking through the camera, you would look at it like that, but it's easier to see it this way. Okay. Now, there's going to be a distance from the camera to the subject, this blue piece of paper. It could be a centimeter, it could be 10 meters, it could be 5 kilometers, it doesn't matter. No matter where the lens is focused, only subject matter at that distance will be in focus. Okay, so if this piece of paper was 10 meters from my camera, and my camera was set to focus at 10 meters, then only things 10 meters away from the lens or away from the camera will be in focus. Okay, now this is where the circles of confusion part come in. I'm going to get rid of this for a second. I want you to imagine a circle. You got it in your mind? Good. Now make that circle so small that you can't tell it's a circle. It looks like a dot. Okay. Now take that dot and very slowly start to make it bigger in your imagination. And as you start to make it bigger, at some point, you'll be able to see that it's not a dot. It's actually a circle. And as you make it bigger, the circle will increase in size. Okay. Now, the point at which you can tell it's not a dot, but actually a circle, will vary on a number of things, including, most appropriately, the distance from you to your monitor or to the print or whatever it is you're looking at. Okay, so back to our visual aid here. This is our camera. This is our subject, in this case 10 meters away. There will be a range of distance in front of the subject and a range behind the subject that will appear to be in focus. Okay, it's not in focus, but like the really tiny circle that looks like a dot, it will appear to be in focus. And then the farther from the subject you get toward the camera, or the farther you get away from the subject behind the camera, that circle will get bigger and bigger. Okay, you may have heard the term bokeh, which actually refers to a Japanese term, and it relates to how the lens defines out of focus elements, because lenses are themselves circles. Okay, so Yeah, this is Capture One right now. The other program I was working with was Affinity Photo and also SNS HDR. So anything that you can see in your subject that appears to be in focus from the front of the subject to behind the subject is what's called the depth of field. Okay, that distance where you see a dot and not a circle is the depth of field. Now, depth of field varies based on a number of factors. I'm going to put this thing down. We don't need it anymore. Your sensor size is one factor in the depth of field. Um, Cell phones like this one have very tiny sensors. The sensor in here is about the size of your baby fingernail. Okay, small sensors have larger depth of field. Your lens focal length, which is the distance from the lens elements from the entrance pupil to the sensor, has an impact on depth of field. Wide angle lenses have a larger depth of field than longer lenses. Your aperture setting, your f-stop, has an impact on depth of field. So a lens that has a small f-stop, maybe f16 or something like that, will have a larger depth of field than a lens that's wide open at f2.8 or f4. Okay, so that, and also subject distance, the distance from your subject, from your camera to your subject, has an impact on depth of field. So if we take a look at this image, this is a depth of field calculator from my phone. Let me just do that. Get rid of the distractions. Okay, so this is a Nikon D3. We're picking up Nikon today. A 50 millimeter lens at f4 with a subject distance of 5 meters. But those parameters, this is a full frame sensor, a 50 millimeter lens, f4, 5 meters. Our depth of field is 2.5 meters. Okay, so everything from 4 meters in front of the subject, or 4 meters distant from the camera, to 6.5 meters distant from the camera will appear to be in focus. Okay. This is the same camera, but now we've got a 12 millimeter lens at f8, and a focus distance of just over half a meter, 610 centimeters. Okay. So now our near focus, what will appear to be in focus, begins at half a meter from the camera and goes out to infinity, because this is a very wide angle lens, and wide angle lenses have huge depth of field. Now here you'll see something called hyperfocal distance. And some people think that to set hyperfocal distance on your lens, you set your lens to infinity. That's not hyperfocal distance. We'll go back to this image. For this 50 millimeter lens on the Nikon D3, the hyperfocal distance is 20.8 meters. What that means is if you set the focus point on your lens, on this particular lens, at 20 meters, everything to infinity, the far focus limit will be infinity. And then the minimum focus distance will, again, depend on the lens, but that's the broadest range of focus you'll get for that f-stop with that lens. Okay. So if you need to focus up close, everything behind you will be out of focus. But if you're looking for, if you're doing street photography or landscape photography and you want to have infinity as your rear focus point, then you set whatever the hyperfocal distance for that lens is as your focus point. Okay, so let's go to this lens, for example, the same camera. But this time we've got the Nikkor 60 millimeter micro, which is a macro lens. We've set it at 10 meters at f8. Here the hyperfocal distance is 15 meters, but at a 10 meter focus point, our depth of field is 23 meters. So everything from 6 meters in front of, away from the camera, excuse me, to 30 meters away from the camera will appear to be in focus. Okay. Remember, only items at 10 meters will actually be in focus, but anything from 6 meters to 30 meters will appear to be in focus. If we go to keep the same lens and we go to back out of here for a second. So if we go to, because this is a micro lens or a macro lens, Nikon calls them micro rather than macro, I'm not sure why. But because this is a micro lens, if we keep the same 60 millimeter micro at f8, same camera, but now we're focused at 1 centimeter, our depth of field now is 7/1000ths of a centimeter. Okay, that's 70 microns, and a micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. So that's not a lot of depth of field. And this is where focus stacking is most often used in macro photography. Because if you imagine, we've got from basically zero depth of field. So if you're taking a picture of an insect, for example, you could have, the front part of the antenna in focus, but not the eyeball, and certainly not the rest of the body. So with a depth of field that narrow, you get into focus stacking. And focus stacking, where HDR captures images at different exposure values, focus stacking captures images at different focus points. Okay. Now, if you're getting into doing macro photography, and macro photography really begins at 1:1. What that means is that every lens has a minimum focusing distance, a minimum distance from the camera at which it will maintain focus. Anything closer than that, you get into macro photography. But in macro, when you talk about 1:1, what you're saying is that a subject that is, say, 1 centimeter long in reality, maybe it's a small wasp, for example, will appear to be 1 centimeter long on your sensor. At 2:1, something that's 1 centimeter long in reality will appear to be 2 centimeters long on your sensor. At 1:2, anything that's 1 centimeter long will appear to be half a centimeter long on your sensor. Okay. If you had a Canon camera and you had the Canon MPE lens, you can get down to 5:1. Okay. So that means that something that's a centimeter long in reality will appear to be 5 centimeters long on your sensor. That's a huge magnification. But again, when you're dealing with that narrow depth of field, you're going to need some specialized equipment, because I defy you to change the focus point on your camera by 70 microns or 50 microns or 20 microns, depending on how close you're getting and what lens you're using. There are specific tools for doing macro work. This isn't a talk on macro photography, but we'll just mention them quickly. You can get manual focusing rails, you can get computerized focusing rails, and what those will do is move the camera in very tiny increments. The other way to do it automatically is to use something called focus bracketing. The Nikon Z cameras have built-in focus bracketing. The Phase 1 IQ4 camera has built-in focus bracketing. I believe some of the Fuji cameras have built-in focus bracketing. And the way that works is that you set your camera up on a tripod and you set the near focus point and you set the far focus point. So if we're shooting our wasp, you'd focus on the point closest to the camera, and then focus on, you'll still need a macro lens for this, focus on the point farthest from the camera. And then depending on the software that's inside the camera, it will either automatically figure out, based on the lens and the depth of field, how many images it has to take. Or you'll have to do some calculation to figure out how many images you have to take. Then you press the shutter and the camera will make an exposure, move the lens, make an exposure, move the lens, make an exposure, move the lens. There's really no reason other than the fact that they haven't bothered that more digital cameras don't do focus stacking internally. It's really just a firmware update because if you have an autofocus lens, it's using ultrasonic motors to rotate the focus of the lens, and it can do that a lot finer than you can. Anyway, that's all we're going to talk about for macro work. Focus stacking is not just limited to macro work. You can use it for landscape work. You can use it for architectural work. Let's say, for example, you have a wonderful mountain scene with flowers in the foreground, excuse me, and mountains in the background. And no matter where you set your focus point, unless you're using a 12 millimeter lens, then there's no way that you're going to get all of that in focus. So if we take a look at these images here, these are some images of a log. And if I just bring this up here, you can see that in this image, the focus point's pretty much right here at the front of the log. But if you look back towards the end of the log, it's out of focus. So this was made with my Sony 24-105 lens at f8, and the depth of field is pretty shallow. Okay, I just shot this as a demonstration. It's not going to win any photo awards. But if I turn on the focus mask and bring up the other images, you can see that each image has a different point of focus area that's in focus. I'm just going to move out so you can see right from the front all the way to the very back. Now, I did this manually, and if you have your camera on a tripod, if you have a camera that allows you to set a focus point on the LCD, if you can move it around and choose where you want the camera to focus, then you can do focus stacking manually. It's not as efficient and it's not as fast, but it is possible. So what I did was I picked a focus point and made sure the camera was in focus, took an image, moved the focus point back a little bit, took another image, moved the focus point back a little bit, took another image, et cetera, until I had gone the full length of the log. Okay. Now to stack these, we're going to use Affinity Photo again. There are a couple of other programs. Again, Photoshop will allow you to do focus stacking. The two big ones are Helicon Focus and Zarine Stacker. If you're getting seriously into focus stacking, especially with macros, I don't do a lot of them. So I just use Affinity Photo for most of my focus stacking work. So again, we're going to go to File. We're going to go to New Focus Merge, and we're going to click Add, and we're going to go to our focus stack, and we're going to forgot to hold down the control key. Hold down the control key and go down, select all our images, click open. Okay. So it's going to load all those images into our stack. I'm not going to run it because it'll take several minutes to cram through 29 there's however many images there are. And but we'll assume that it did that, and what it's going to end up with is something that looks like this. So this is our focus stacked image. I did a quick levels adjustment just so it looks a little brighter. And if we zoom in a little bit, I should have focus stacked this part as well, but I didn't at the time, and it's too late now. So if we zoom in a little bit, you can see now as we move back through the log that the whole log is now in focus. So if this was a building that you were shooting, or again a forest scene or any kind of landscape, the idea is the same. Whether you're doing macro work, whether you're doing a mountain valley or whatever, the process is the same. So that's all we're going to say about focus stacking. What was that? Okay, so the next the next section of this talk is on image stacking. And we can turn that off. And we're going to go to this image. It's going to bring this up. So it's actually very hard with my Sony camera to generate noise. But I made these images, they're a little bit underexposed, but I made these images at ISO 10,000 just to illustrate a point. So this is just a piece of bull kelp on the shore. And I'm going to bring this up in Affinity Photo just so you can see it. ISO. Okay. So this is our ISO 10,000 image, and again, I just add a little levels adjustment so you can see it better. And if we zoom into 100%, you can see that at ISO 10,000, there's not a lot of resolution. And this is a 43 megapixel camera. There's not a lot of resolution, and there is a lot of noise. At what point you reach that, how high you can go on the ISO scale with your camera is something you have to play with and find out for yourself. So this image is basically unusable. So we're going to close it. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to go down here and create a new stack. Same as before. I'm going to go to add, and we're going to pick our images, open them. Okay, and it says automatically align images. Now again, this was shot with a tripod, so it's not really necessary. But it's, if you shot it handheld, then that can help to match up the various images. We're not going to run this because again, it takes several minutes, but I will open the finished product. But wait, there's more. Through the magic of television, we have this one. Again, I added a levels adjustment and if we go to 100% and let it load, again, it's not great, but if you compare it to the other image, it's certainly not bad. Again, this is at ISO 10,000. Now, over here, you'll see that there are a number of different options in terms of how you present these images. Mean, median, outlier, maximum. They have different uses and they create different effects. For noise reduction, you generally use mean. For the rest of them have different purposes, and we'll talk about a couple of those in a minute. But just, even if I zoom into 200%, oops, give me back my image here. I zoom into 200%. There's still some noise there, and this doesn't have any noise reduction applied to it. But again, this is at ISO 10,000, and if we reopen our original image, turn on our levels adjustment, and go to 200%. Yeah, there's a bit of a difference. Okay, so that's one reason why you might want to use focus stacking. No, go away. And also close that one. Another reason you might want to use focus stacking relates to movement, but this time we're going to be doing it intentionally. So if I go here and not that one, take this image. Okay, so this image was shot at 1/8,000th of a second. This is just down at Holland Point. And it's a nice image. If you want, we can do it in black and white instead. Um, but this is a very, very high shutter speed. In the film days, one of my favorite films was Kodachrome 25. I loved the colors, but I also loved the low ISO value and the way it worked. Um, in digital days, base ISO is generally 100. And so if you're trying to get a slow exposure, um, most photographers use neutral density filters to block the light coming through the camera so that they can get a nice smooth image. Um, and but if you don't have neutral density filters, or if you're interested in exploring other options, we could say take these 12 images the same scene, again, the camera on a tripod, but the rocks are all the same, but the water is moving. And we can combine all of these into one image stack. So I'll go back here. Again, we would go here, we would go to, oops, not a panorama, we haven't got to panoramas yet. Go to new stack, add, and we would go here, choose our 12 images, open, align them, et cetera, et cetera. And then we would run a focus stack on them, but we're not going to do that because it would take too long. So through the magic of television, we will just go back here and we're in the wrong spot. So let's get out of that. Go here and click on this one. Okay, so this is the 12 images combined. You can see that we need to do a little bit of cropping here. Um, drag that in a bit. That looks to be about right. Okay. So again, this is 12 images, 12 80 megapixel or 80 megabyte images. So it's going to take a little bit to work with. But if you're looking for a winter storm look, you might want to use mean. Um, if you go to meridian, you get a slightly different look. Um, but for this particular image, I would probably go with maximum, because with maximum, what it's doing is taking the maximum amount of information from all of 12 images and stacking them together, and you end up with something that looks like this. It's pretty cool. Um, some of them are just unusual, like if we do total, for example, it just looks like that. Um, kurtosis gives you barely, barely visible. We could maybe crank up the levels here. Um, it's not really going to do much. We'd have to increase our exposure. Anyway, for this particular image, I'd probably go with maximum. Um, and that combines all. That's not giving us the slow movement look that we were looking for, but it does give you an interesting wave. The other thing is, because we have all 12 of our images, we can pick on each one and we can turn them off and on and see how that affects the shot. We can also create a mask for each or any of the images and block out parts of it. We can change the blend modes, do all that kind of funky stuff. But that's enough of that for right now. So let's close this one. I want to show you a couple of other examples. Um, Back over here to capture one and that. So this image was made with my phone, and this was in Tofino at Crystal Cove. So this is 12 images. This was shot handheld and stacked in Affinity Photo, and then tone mapped a little bit. But you can start to see that nice smooth movement of the waves. So it's not bad for a cell phone. And then there's another image here, and this is Coca-Cola Canyon outside of Hope, and this was also shot handheld with my phone. I was very lucky that day. There was absolutely no wind, so if you look at the branches and the leaves, there's no movement at all. But this is 30 images shot in a burst and then stacked up in Affinity Photo and pushed around a bit. Okay, so this is the sort of thing you can get from image stacking. If you don't like moving water, you could shoot clouds and get cloud movement over a period of time. These are just ideas. Okay, so we're really moving along here. It's taking me less time to talk about these. Well, it's taking me less time to gloss over these than it is to talk about Snapseed. Okay, so the fourth part of our talk tonight is on panoramas. And before we talk about panoramas, we need to specify the difference between panoramic and a panorama. So if we look at this image, this is a panoramic image. It's a very broad scene. Again, this is Holland Point. It's just down the road from where we're lucky enough to live. But this is one single image made with my Leawa 12mm lens. So it's a very broad field of view, but that's only one image. Conversely, let's take this image. This is a panorama. Excuse me. This was also made with the same camera, but with a shot at 35 millimeters. And this is up at on Mill Hill in Langford, looking down toward the Esquimalt Naval Base over here. So this is 8 images. So basically one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 2 rows of 4 images. And this is not a panoramic image, but it is a panorama. And there are two main reasons why you'd want to shoot panoramas. I have one more example to show you. This was made with a very old 10 megapixel camera. And this is Bastion Square, but let's just zoom in a little bit. There we go. This is 118 images. This was just one of those Mike trying to make smoke come out of his camera. And again, very little wind that day, which worked out well. And this was several years ago, so no, this is not during COVID. This was just happened to be a winter day and nobody around. And when there were people around, I did all the top shots, and then I waited for them to leave to do the bottom shots. But you can, if you've ever heard of gigapixels, then people are making images with literally thousands of images, and you need a much bigger, stronger, faster computer than I have in order to do that. But if you look up gigapixels online, you'd be amazed. So Why shoot panoramas to begin with? Well, there's two main reasons. One is that if I look at this image, this is similar, slightly different perspective. When you can see how dirty my sensor is, so ignore the dots. I did not intentionally set out to shoot this woman. I was down, had my tripod set up, and I was working, and she came and sat down, and I thought, okay, well, if you want to be in the picture, that's up to you. But let's just take these two. Okay. So different perspectives, basically the same scene. This one's at 12 millimeters, and this one's at 24 millimeters. So at 24 millimeters, this is all of the scene I can get in one shot. But if I take a series of images like this, then by panning across the scene, I can capture more of it. Okay. Now, a couple things to deal with when making panoramas. First and foremost, use manual exposure, because especially if you're shooting into the sun, you're going to get a broad range of exposures across the scene. So figure out where the brightest part of your final scene is going to be, set your camera on manual, set the exposure for that, so otherwise you're going to blow out the highlights. Thing number two to remember, never use a polarizing filter for making panoramas. The reason is that polarizing filters, the way they work, at the very beginning I mentioned that light it scatters in all directions. A polarizing filter is designed to block out all light except light traveling in a specific direction. Okay. Now imagine that your polarizing filter is blocking out light, but now you're turning your camera. Okay. So you're going to end up with some parts of your image looking much darker and more polarized than the rest of your image. So use manual exposure. Don't use a polarizing filter. The third thing that you run into with making panoramas is called parallax. And parallax, the easiest way to illustrate parallax is to hold your hand out in front of you like this with your thumb up. But don't focus on your thumb. Focus on the wall or whatever is behind you in the distance. And then close one eye and then open that one and close the other eye. And you'll see your thumb move back and forth. That's parallax. That's because you have two eyes looking on one thing, and they're seeing them from a different perspective. Okay. Now, with panoramas, if you don't allow for parallax, what's going to happen is items in the foreground and items in the background are going to shift places as you rotate your camera. You will hear people talking about the nodal point and having to rotate your camera around the nodal point. If anybody ever you can actually go online and look for nodal point heads, and there are companies that will sell you nodal heads in order for doing panoramas. If anybody ever tells you that you need to rotate your camera around the nodal point, what you look at them and say, did you mean the front nodal point or the rear nodal point? And they won't have an answer for that. And then you can kind of sneak up closer to them and say, actually, what you're looking for is the entrance pupil. And then they'll go, ooh, because they won't have any idea what you're talking about. So this is an image I stole. This is actually, if you go to this link, you can download this PDF file. This is where I stole this image from. And it's a very good explanation about what the entrance pupil is, what the nodal point is, et cetera, and why it's important to focus on the entrance pupil. Basically, in quick terms, if you hold up a lens with the front of the lens facing you with both lens caps off, because otherwise you're just going to see the lens cap. If you take the lens cap off the lens, hold it up to the light, and looks into the lens with the front of the lens facing you, you're going to see the aperture ring. That's what adjusts the size of the aperture somewhere inside the lens. Okay, where that aperture is physically located and where it seems to be located inside the lens is different. And the reason it's different is because in order for you to see that aperture ring, light is going into the front of the lens, bouncing off the aperture ring and coming back out the lens. But it's going through glass lens elements to do that. And that's changing the path of the light. Okay, so if you look up here, for example, you'll see these lens elements. This is where the aperture is in this particular lens. But because of the way the light gets bent, the entrance pupil is right here, or appears to be here. So if you're using this lens, this hypothetical lens, you would have to rotate your camera around this point. Okay. Now, depending on the lens, sometimes the entrance pupil can be in front of the actual lens. Sometimes it can be behind the lens. Down here, the entrance pupil of this lens is actually behind the lens. This is the front nodal point. So there's a difference between rotating your camera around this point and rotating your camera around that point. Okay. Now, if you were lucky enough, I don't know if the camera on my computer can focus on this, but if you were lucky enough to own a Lewa 12mm lens, right here there's a blue ring, and it's probably not, I don't know if the camera's going to pick it up, but right there it says entrance pupil. It's very handy for them because to make panoramas with this lens, I would rotate it around that point. Okay. Most lenses, actually that's the only lens I've ever seen so far that actually marks the entrance pupil on the lens. For most lenses, you have to buy a panorama head, and then you can go online and there are various tutorials that will explain to you how to find the entrance pupil. They'll call it the nodal point. You can ignore that, and they'll show you how to calculate the entrance pupil for that camera and that lens. But wait, there's more. If you're using a zoom lens, the entrance pupil will change based on the focal length of the lens, just to make life interesting. Okay, so that whole idea of rotating around the nodal point, or correction, around the entrance pupil, is to avoid parallax in your images. Parallax is more or less of a problem based on the camera to subject distance. And the panorama software will do what it can to eliminate parallax when it creates your panorama. So yes, you can shoot panoramas handheld. If you have some idea of where the entrance pupil is on your lens, you can try and rotate around that point. If not, what you want to do is, rather than holding your camera steady and rotating the camera, what you do is take something, could be a toonie, could be a pine cone, could be whatever, put it on the ground, okay, and then move yourself around that central point. It's about the best you can do handheld. If you have your camera sitting on a regular ball head, or on a three-way, a regular tripod head, you're not going to be able to move the camera back and forth. You need a special arm for that. If you want to get really picky and really expensive, for people who do gigapixel panoramas and stuff like that, there's actually a computerized, motorized cradle that you set your camera and lens into the cradle, feed in the parameters of the camera and the lens that you're using, tell the software in the cradle how many images you want to make, how many rows and columns, and then press the button and it will go through and shoot all of the images for you, eliminating parallax in the process. But those heads are several $1,000s. So unless you're really into making gigapixels, you probably don't want to go that way. Okay, so enough of that. So these 7 images here I combined to make one panorama. You know the drill by now. You go here to Affinity Photo or Photoshop. Um, there are other programs as well. PTGUI is probably the best known and most powerful panorama software on the market today. It's a couple $100s. There are a couple of different versions. Um, and so that's one. Hugin, Hugin, is a free software. It was developed in part by one of our group members, Daniel Germain. It's very powerful software. The user interface is a bit technical, so I don't know that I would recommend it for beginners, but you've got to start somewhere. GIMP, I mentioned GIMP earlier as an alternative to Affinity Photo or Photoshop. There is a plugin for GIMP that does panoramas. I've never tried it. I don't know how good it is. If you use a Windows-based computer, you can go to Microsoft.com and look up Microsoft Image Composite Editor. And one function of the Microsoft Image Composite Editor is a panorama routine. If you have Lightroom, it does panoramas. There are a number of different options, but my favorite panorama software of all time was actually from a company out of Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, called Color.com, and they made software called AutoPano. There was AutoPano Pro and AutoPano Giga. Unfortunately, the company that make GoPro bought Color.com and put them out of business, which kind of sucked in my opinion. But that's the way it goes. So as I say, you know the drill. So you go to New Panorama, you select the images that you want, and I'm not even going to bother to do that. And we're going to open our finished product. So, yeah, this one. Okay, so just add a little brightening. So this is our completed panorama. This is 7 images made with a 24mm lens. Again, you'll have to ignore all the dust spots on my sensor. I had my camera and my tripod pretty leveled. If you end up with a tilted horizon, what you can do is in Lightroom or Capture One or Affinity Photo or whatever you're doing, click on the crop tool and hold down the control key or the command key on Mac. Click on one spot, hold down the mouse, drag it across, line up the horizon, let go, and it will automatically level the horizon for you. There are those who disparagingly refer to the horizon police. Personally, I think horizons are supposed to be level unless you're making an artistic statement. So it's up to you. Okay, so now we've got our just going to cancel that. We've got our completed panorama, but we've got this blank space around the outside edge, and we've also got these little darkened spots from using the raw files without lens correction. So there's a couple of things we can do here. One is to just use the crop tool and crop tool, not select tool. Just go to unconstrained and we can drag it down and drag it up and drag it in and like so. And then, oops, just a little corner down here. So let's just drag that up. That's pretty close. Okay, so that would be our cropped image. But there is another option, slightly more advanced. We're going to cancel that. What we're going to do is, now I honestly, I imagine this is possible in Photoshop, but I haven't used Photoshop in so many years, I don't know how to do it. So I'll show you how to do it in Affinity Photo, and you can figure it out from there. So we're going to click the rectangle tool, and the rectangle tool will create its own layer. We're going to set a red stroke and no a zero fill and about somewhere around 4 pixels. Okay, so now we're going to draw our rectangle inside like this and move that in a little bit. So now, back to our move tool, now we have a red rectangle that shows basically what we would end up cropping. Okay, but we still have all this extra stuff. Now I mentioned before about in painting, and there's a macro that you can get from the Affinity Photos um, tutorials page called in paint after straighten, and they used it to demonstrate how to get rid of the white spot after you've rotated your horizon. So we're just going to click that and let it do its thing. How well this works is very image dependent, and um, so sometimes it works very well, sometimes not so well, but we'll let it run. Again, I got like 1, 2, 3, I have 5 different programs running right now, and I'm working. This image here has got to be um, close to 500 megabytes, I'm guessing. Um, well, yeah, that didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because I'm trying to in-paint the rectangle. Trained professionals, do not try this at home. Okay, let's go back to our library and we'll try this again. So basically what it's doing is it's going through and looking for the blank areas in the image. It's selecting those blank areas, then it's expanding the selection by a couple of pixels, and then it's running in paint on that selection. Uh, you could do it manually, but it's much easier to have a macro to do it for you, especially when you're on the right layer. Sheesh. It's gotten pretty quiet in the chat box. I don't know if everybody's gone waiting for the recording and I'm talking to myself or not, but oh well, we got to make the recording anyway. So thank you for that. At least one person's still here. Ta-da! Through the magic of Photoshop, or Affinity Photo in this case. Okay, we still have these little, excuse me, we still have these little flares in the corners. Those are easy to deal with. But if we zoom into 100% and go over here, remember the red rectangle shows the borders of the actual image versus the in-painted image. Now here, it actually did a pretty good job. There's a bit of duplication here. You could take the in-painting brush and just kind of wipe that out if you want. You know, just go for something a little different. Um, okay, fine. Duplicate it. See if I care. Um, there we go. So you can go through and you know take out duplications if you want, but overall that looks pretty good. Now we go up here. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Got a double width. Now right here you'll see that it copied in a piece of the mount. This is where we would have cropped to, but excuse me. So far, you know, again we could try and take that out. Not bad. Okay, we can live with that. Um, that looks pretty good. Take take this out. That's better. Okay, that looks pretty good. Ignore the dust spots on the sensor. Get over to the other side here. Oh, there's the moon. Okay, so we get rid of some of this. And you can, if you want, just you know, use the selection brush um, and make it a little bigger, and just select an area like that, and then go to filters. No, I don't. In paint, there it is. And just click in paint, and it will just in paint that selection. Ta-da! Just like that. And you don't need that selection anymore. So that's looking pretty good. And we'll scroll down here. Another dust spot. Uh, that's the selection brush, not the in painting brush. Um, there. There we go. Get rid of that. Okay, so we get scroll down here now. Again, if I zoom in, it didn't do so well on this side. Um, so we're going to have to deal with that. But that's, you know, overall, it's not bad. So we'll go back to our zoom out, and there's also a spot down here where you can see the in painting didn't work very well. But compared to our rectangle, we did pretty well. So if we take our crop tool, we can leave that. We can pull it up a little bit there and pull it in probably to about there, and hit apply. So that we've captured more of our image than we would have if we just simply cropped without in painting. And then once we're done with that, we just take our red rectangle and we just delete it. And there you go. There's your finished pen. Well, it's not finished yet. It hasn't been processed in terms of shadows, highlights, sharpening, or anything like that. But there's your panorama. Okay, so we're going to close this one, and I'm just going to show you one more example. Same same spot, just rotated 180 degrees. There was a piece of bull kelp, and I made 5 exposures of the bull kelp. Let's just brighten it up a little bit. So this was probably, well, at the far end here, um, actually, parallax is more of an issue when you're up close. And so this is only about 3 or 4 meters from my camera. And even at that, the software was able to, I didn't have a nodal head, a panorama head for my tripod. So I just, with the camera sitting on the tripod and uh, focusing on the bull kelp for each of the 5 images, I was able to make this. And it turned out pretty well. You can't, even if we zoom in, um, you can't really see any stitching errors or any parallax issues. Now, I'm going to close this one because there is something else I wanted to show you. Nobody's asked yet, but can you make HDR panoramas? Yes, you can. So let's go back here for a second. And let's go to HDR panorama. Okay, now if you're using the current version of Lightroom, or if you're using PTGUI, you can just select all of your, how many do I have here? 48 images. You can select all 48 images and um, do the HDR merge and the panorama all in one swell swoop. Um, I've tried that with Affinity Photo and I was less than impressed by the results. Um, so I tend to do the HDR merges first and then take the HDR merges and create images, create a panorama from those instead. Um, I talked earlier about SNS HDR and um, but and I mentioned one of the reasons I prefer SNS HDR to Affinity Photo for HDR is that in Affinity Photo there's no way to save presets. So if I'm going to tone map these 3 images to a point where I'm happy with the results, um, then a second here, there we go. Then I'm going to want to be able to tone map all of these sets of images the same. So again, I could have spent the extra $30 US and bought the SNS HDR Pro, but to me it wasn't worth it. I can simply create an HDR merge of these 3 images, set the sliders to where I want them, create a preset, merge the next set, use the same preset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then um, create the merges from there. So these are 2 sets of 3 images made with my cell phone again, and I want to show you something about panoramas that you may run into, especially if you're shooting handheld and also dependent on. Actually, there's one more thing. Since we're talking about cell phone images, there's one more thing I forgot to show you. If you have a cell phone, you have in your software, most likely you have something called sweep panorama mode. And to make a sweep panorama, you simply press the start button and then you rotate your phone and it makes a panorama for you, which is all well and good. Um, and actually, while I have my phone in hand, we'll jump tracks yet again. On this particular phone, the lens is right in the middle of the camera. Um, and so remember that. We'll come back to that in a second. So This image here um, is a scene in Tofino. Now, this top image was made with my phone, with this phone in sweep panorama mode, and because it's a wide angle lens, has about a 28 millimeter equivalent focal length in full frame terms. You get a fair bit of distortion because you're moving it. Okay, this is exactly the same scene. You can see the island there and the island there and this island and this island. But this scene was made from about 12 individual images made with my phone and then joined up in panorama software. So this is what you get by making a panorama with your phone. This is what you get by uh, shooting images with your phone or your camera and then joining them together. Um, One thing I think I forgot to mention when we'll come back to so take a look at these 5 images here for a second. Okay, you need to, in order to make a panorama, you need to give the software what are called control points. Okay, and a control point is something that's visible in 2 or more images that it can join up. So if you look at this image, for example, um, you take a look at this round black spot, and this round black spot is the same. This point here and this point here, this point here and this point here are the same, um, et cetera, et cetera. This white rock down here in the corner and this rock are the same. Between these 2 images, we've got this rock here, this area up here, this area up here. So what the software does in order to create the panorama is it establishes what it calls control points, which is the same pixel, if you will, or the same place in 2 or more images. And then it uses those to basically take each individual image and kind of line them up, bend them, twist them, whatever it needs to do to make them fit together. So when you're shooting panoramas, you should allow for about 30% overlap. This is a little bit less than 30%. This is maybe 25% overlap between this part and this part. Okay. Again, we've got about 25, maybe 30% here between here and here. So you need about 30% overlap in order for the software to be able to join the images together. And if you're doing more than one row, of course, then you need overlap top and bottom as well. Okay. So that's control points. Now, yeah, we'll come back to this. So these are 2 sets of panoramas made with my phone, and we're going to jump back over here to Affinity Photo, and we're just going to pick one of them. Now these are from those. I took basically 18 images and made 6 HDR sets out of them. And if I take this one, for example, so this is an HDR panorama made with my phone. It's not bad. There's a bit of bowing because of the lens. But what I wanted to point out to you is when you're shooting handheld, especially if you're using something that doesn't have a really high resolution, if we were to zoom in here, this is what's called a stitching error. Okay, obviously the shoreline did not just drop off. There's no waterfall in the middle of the ocean, and that can happen. And so in this case, there's not too much you can do about it. I tried, I go to file, open. This is a different software, the same image, but aligned with different software. But again, if we zoom in, you can still see there's a stitching error right there, and there's another one right there and there. So this image as a panorama is basically no good. It's too bad because the clouds were really interesting, but there's not much you can do with that. Depending on how bad it is, sometimes you can use something like in painting, or if there was just one section where it was split. So, for example, if we were to zoom in here, you see that split there. So we could, in theory, take our selection tool, line it up, kind of there, and then well, we should be able to. Come on, now, it's not working. Why are you not working? Um, we should be able to move the selection, and I'm not sure why it's not working, but we could try to line up the horizon. For this particular image, I don't think it's worth it, so I'm not going to bother. Um, but so there's one last thing to talk about. I mentioned different software for making panoramas. If you make a panorama in Affinity Photo, you don't have a choice in terms of projections. Now, projections are ways to make non-flat things flat. So if you think about this particular image, it was covering almost 180-degree field of view. The cell phone in this case moved in an arc. So basically, you could think of it as being like a cylinder, like this, and rotating. So we need to take that partial cylinder and we need to flatten it out, and that's a projection. There are different styles of projections, and so I'm going to close out of this for now, and I'm going to close out of just minimize that for now, and I'm going to go to. This is the software I was telling you about that's no longer available, but it'll do for our demonstration purposes. Um, I'm just going to drag that over here. Okay, let's just build a quick panorama here. All right, edit. Drag that over here so you can see it. So this is the edit window. There we go. Now, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it on the screen, but these are different projections: spherical, cylindrical, a mirror ball, little planet, planar, Mercator, fisheye, panini, hammer, and orthographic. Those are different ways of bending the image to make it look normal. Um, so this is intended to be flat. So right now it's using a planar projection. If we change it to cylindrical, for example, it's going to take out some of the bow because what we're telling the software is that when we made the images to make up this panorama, we moved our camera in a cylindrical motion. If we had a multi-row panorama where we were moving our camera not only this way, but also this way, we would go from cylindrical to spherical. Now, in this case, it's not going to look, not too bad. Um, if we went to mirror ball, that's not going to work in this case, so we'll ignore that one. Little planet, it's for making 360 degrees. If you have a fisheye lens like this one, or wider 6 millimeter lens, then we can get into that. But basically, there are different projections. Now, if you're working with Lightroom, they give you, and I believe Photoshop is the same, you have three different projections: planar, cylindrical, and spherical. And probably best to start with planar because basically you want your images to look like they're flat. But if it can't, if it if you've made a cylindrical panorama with too many images, it'll just tell you it can't do it. Um, if you're working with if you go and get Huggin or the Microsoft Image Composite Editor, you have, like with this, multiple choices for projections, and each one of them will give you a different view. Okay, so I wanted to show you the close out of that. No, we don't need to save it. Okay, so let's go back to here, and we'll go back to here. And this is an example of the same images made. So 5 panoramas made with 5 different software packages. So Affinity Photo was one, Lightroom was one, PTGUI was one, Huggin was one, and I think Microsoft Image Composite Editor was one. So you can see that each one of them rendered the image slightly differently. And if you look at, which one is it now? Not that one. These are pretty small resolution images. One of these, at least, has a stitching error. But anyway, we already talked about stitching errors. So the main reason why you would want to make multiple images into a panorama is because the field of view that you want to capture is wider than you can get with one shot. There's another reason that you can do it as well, and that is if you think about something like the, this is the, if you think of something like the Phase 1 IQ 4150, it's 150 megapixels, and that's a serious amount of resolution. It's also huge files. With the Fuji GFX 100 50 megapixel camera, or correction, 100 megapixel camera, each file is 200 megabytes. On my camera, they're only 80 megabytes. But this here, pull that up so you can see it. This is an HDR panorama made with Affinity Photo and my cell phone. Okay, and if I zoom in a little bit, this is a low-res image, so you can't really see the detail. But if I back out of that and switch over to this image, and this is a 100% view of the previous image. So this was made with my cell phone, and that's not bad resolution for a cell phone camera. So with every image that you make, whether it's a 16 megapixel cell phone or whether it's a 24 megapixel DSLR or whether it's a 40 megapixel or a 60 megapixel camera, whatever, it doesn't matter. When you combine them into a panorama, you're creating a much bigger image with higher resolution because it's taking all of the information that it can get. Um, and Duncan asked me what size computer am I running. Well, what you're looking at is a 4K screen, um, and so it's 3840 by 2160, and that the auto panel software was not, it's very old software. It wasn't designed. So I apologize. Everything looks so small. And nice to see you, Duncan. But anyway, it's 8:29 and in exactly 1 minute, Marcia's going to bang the door down and drag me away to have supper. Um, so I better close out of that. I thank you all for coming. And yeah. So if you have any questions, you can type a question into the comment field for this meetup. You can leave a comment on YouTube, and you can go to our blog site. And you know, either way, I'll just fire away, and I'll do my best to answer you. And if I don't know the answer, I'll make something up, and well, you won't know the difference anyway. So have a great night. Thanks for being here. And that's about it. Bye now.